The night was supposed to be just another routine patrol. But what happened next would shock an entire community. In the heart of a busy city, a veteran police chief, respected, tough, and undeniably good at her job, found herself in an unthinkable situation. Chief Angela Carter had spent years protecting and serving, breaking down barriers in law enforcement. But that night, she wasn't just a leader in uniform, she was a target. It started with a traffic stop gone wrong. A junior officer, known for his arrogance and questionable behavior, pulled over a driver for what he claimed was a routine check. But something felt off. Chief Carter, nearby on duty, stepped in to assess the situation. She wasn't expecting hostility, not from one of her own. The moment the officer laid eyes on her, his demeanor shifted. Maybe he didn't recognize her at first. Maybe he didn't care. But what happened next stunned even the bystanders. With anger in his eyes, the officer crossed the line, striking the very woman who outranked him. What he didn't expect? Chief Carter wasn't about to back down. And before he could realize his mistake, he was about to face a response he'd never forget. For a split second, there was silence. The crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk stood frozen, eyes wide with disbelief. The officer, his hand still raised from the strike, took a step back, his own shock mirroring theirs. But Chief Angela Carter didn't stumble. She didn't fall. Instead, she straightened, her jaw tight, her eyes locked onto him. The young officer, Officer Blake Turner, finally seemed to realize what he had done. His chest rose and fell quickly, as if his body was just catching up to his actions. But the problem wasn't just the punch. It was the fact that he had no idea who he had just hit. Then recognition dawned in his eyes. His face paled as if the weight of his mistake had just landed on his shoulders. He had struck the highest-ranking officer in the department. Worse, he had done it in front of witnesses, on a well-lit street, with body cameras rolling. Chief Carter didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. But the look she gave him was enough to make anyone freeze. The air was thick with tension. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak. And then, finally, Carter took a slow step forward. Officer Blake Turner's breath was shallow, his mind racing as Chief Carter closed the distance between them. His hands twitched at his sides, his instincts caught between defense and regret. The other officers on the scene stood still, waiting for someone to make the next move. The tension was thick, pressing down on everyone like an invisible force. Carter didn't lash out. She didn't shout. Instead, she studied him, her expression unreadable. She had spent her career training officers, teaching them the very rules he had just broken. And now she was looking at someone who had let prejudice take control, someone who had let his badge become a weapon instead of a shield. Turner finally found his voice. "I didn't know," he started, but the excuse died in his throat. There was no way to spin this. The body cams had captured everything. The witnesses had seen it unfold. Even if he hadn't realized who she was, it didn't change the fact that he had acted out of anger, not duty. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances. Some shifted on their feet, waiting for Carter's reaction. But she wasn't just thinking about herself. She was thinking about what this moment meant for her, for the department, for the people watching. This wasn't just about one bad officer. This was about a system that had allowed someone like Turner to think his actions would go unchecked. And that thought made her grip tighten into a fist. Turner swallowed hard. He knew what was coming. But so did Carter. Because this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The street felt smaller, the air heavier. Chief Carter held Officer Turner's gaze, unblinking, as the weight of what had just happened settled over everyone. A crowd had gathered, phones recording, their whispers blending into a low hum of disbelief. The tension was unbearable. Officers were trained to de-escalate situations, but Turner had done the opposite. He had escalated it in the worst way possible. And now everyone was watching to see what would happen next. Turner shifted his stance, his breathing uneven. He wasn't just afraid of what Carter would do, he was afraid of what came after. His career, his reputation, the investigation that was surely coming. But Carter wasn't thinking about his future. She was thinking about all the moments that had led to this one. Every time someone like Turner had acted out of impulse. Every time people had lost trust in the badge because of officers who thought they were above the law. A siren wailed in the distance, a reminder that backup was on the way. More officers would be arriving soon. The department was going to have to answer for this. Carter could already hear the headlines, the press conferences, the statements filled with empty words. But she wasn't interested in speeches. She was interested in justice. Turner's hand twitched again, his body tense, as if he was waiting for some kind of out, some way to shift the blame. But there was no getting out of this. The crowd had seen too much. His fellow officers had seen too much. And Carter? She had felt too much. The silence stretched, thick with anticipation. The moment before the storm. Turner swallowed hard, knowing what was coming. Carter took another step forward, her voice steady, controlled. You just made the biggest mistake of your career. And then the blue lights reflected off the buildings, closing in fast. The flashing blue lights painted the street in pulses of cold light as more squad cars screeched to a stop. Officers spilled out, their expressions shifting between confusion and urgency. Some reached for their radios, waiting for direction, while others scanned the tense scene. Chief Carter standing firm, Officer Turner pale and motionless, and a crowd recording every second. Then a new voice cut through the tension. Step back, Chief. Carter turned slowly, her eyes narrowing as she met the gaze of Captain Reynolds. His presence wasn't unexpected. He was the kind of leader who always showed up when things got messy. But the way he spoke, the way his hand hovered near his belt, sent a different message. This wasn't support. This was control. Reynolds' voice was calm, but his eyes flickered with something else. Concern, calculation. We'll handle this internally, he said, his tone firm. Let's not make a scene. A scene. The irony of it almost made Carter laugh. Turner had made a scene the moment he raised his hand against her. The moment he forgot what it meant to wear the badge. And now, instead of holding him accountable, Reynolds wanted to sweep it under the rug. The crowd sensed it too. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the air. People shifted closer, cameras held high. They had seen this before, the system protecting its own. The narrative was being shaped right in front of them. Turner, still frozen, seemed to realize what was happening as well. His relief was almost visible, his shoulders loosening just slightly. He thought he had an out. He thought the old system, the unspoken rules, would save him. But Carter wasn't done. She took a step closer to Reynolds, her voice low but unwavering. Is that what we're doing, Captain? Letting this slide? Reynolds' jaw tightened. Let's talk about this at the station. The officers standing around them looked uneasy, shifting on their feet. Some of them had worked with Carter for years. They knew her. They respected her, and right now they were watching to see if she would back down. Carter inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had fought too hard to let this moment pass. Not this time, she said. And that was when everything changed. The air was thick with anticipation. The officers, the crowd, the flashing lights. Everything felt like it was teetering on the edge of something bigger. Chief Carter locked eyes with Captain Reynolds, unflinching. Turner stood just behind him, still rattled but emboldened by the idea that he might walk away from this untouched. Then a voice from the crowd cut through the silence. We saw everything. The bystanders weren't just witnesses. They were proof. The videos, the body cams, the eyes of every officer on that street. The truth was out, and there was no shutting it down. A ripple of energy moved through the crowd as more people spoke up. You can't cover this up. He hit her first. This is what's wrong with the system. Reynolds exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as if the weight of the situation had finally caught up to him. He wasn't just dealing with a department scandal now. He was dealing with a city watching in real time. The usual playbook wasn't going to work. Not this time. Carter took another step forward, her voice steady. Turner assaulted a superior officer in broad daylight. And you want to handle this internally. She let the words hang, her expression unreadable. We both know what that really means. Reynolds hesitated. The tension in the ranks was obvious. Some officers looked at him, waiting for direction. Others shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between loyalty and integrity. But Carter wasn't waiting for his permission. She turned to the nearest officer and said, "Cuff him." For a moment, no one moved. Turner's face drained of color. He had counted on the system protecting him. He had counted on Carter doing what was expected, backing down. But then, finally, an officer stepped forward. The sound of handcuffs snapping into place echoed over the street. Turner didn't fight it. Maybe he knew there was no way out. Maybe he was too stunned to react. Either way, it was done. The crowd erupted in a mix of cheers and disbelief, their cameras still rolling. The weight of justice finally tipping in a direction they weren't used to seeing. But just as Carter turned back to Reynolds, thinking she had won this battle, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down at the screen, and his expression shifted. He gave her a hard look, one that sent a chill through her. "You sure you want to play it this way, Chief?" he asked quietly. "Because this goes deeper than you think." Carter studied him, her pulse steady but sharp. She had won this round. But Reynolds' tone told her one thing. This wasn't over. Not even close. Carter held Reynolds' gaze, reading between the lines. There was more to this. There always was. But for now, the truth had been exposed. Turner was in cuffs, and the department would have no choice but to deal with the fallout. The crowd, still buzzing with energy, had witnessed something rare. Accountability right in front of them. As Turner was led toward the squad car, his face was a mix of anger and fear. Whatever power he thought he had was gone. The officers who had once worked beside him now looked at him differently, like they had just realized who he really was. And maybe that was part of the problem. He had always been this way. It had just taken the right moment for everyone to see it. Reynolds sighed, shoving his phone back in his pocket. "This isn't over," he muttered. Carter nodded slightly, a knowing look in her eyes. "It never is." The weight of the night settled in, but Carter didn't feel defeated. She felt ready. Change didn't happen in one moment, one arrest, or one fight. But it happened when people refused to look away. And tonight, nobody had.